Hello. Thanks for joining me today. I have some selections picked out to read to you. And like most of the selections I've been making lately, these have to do with the weather. Lately, around here, we've been getting some cooler than usual weather over the last few weeks. So I just started thinking about another time of year where it's very cool. And even though we are very far removed from it, because today is April 28th, we're very far away from this time of year, but I want to read about autumn today. So we will start with some poems from Out and About that have to do with autumn. The Grass House. The grass house is my private place. Nobody can see me in the grass house. Feathery plumes meet over my head. Down here in the green there are seeds, weeds, stalks, pods, and tiny little flowers. Only the cat and some busy hurrying ants know where my grass house is. You can see those leaves starting to change color. Feasts. Apples heaped on market barrows, juicy plums and spicy marrows. Grains of barley carefully stored, feasts of berries, nuts to hoard. And ripe pumpkins, yellow and green, to light with candles at Halloween. Wind. I like the wind, the soft, summery, gentle kind, the gusty, blustery, fierce kind, ballooning out the curtains, blowing things about, wild and willful everywhere. I do like the wind. Misty. Mist in the morning, raw and nippy, leaves on the pavement wet and slippy, sun on fire behind the trees, muddy boots, muddy knees. Shop windows lighted early, soaking grass, dewy, pearly. Red, lemon, orange, and brown, silently, softly, the leaves float down. Autumn. The next autumn story I want to read is from Old Bear and His Friends by Jane Hissey. And before we start reading this story, I want to talk about an object that shows up that I wasn't very familiar with, and you might not be either. It's called a conker. A conker is a brown, I guess you could call it a nut. It's a little bit bigger than an acorn. It's round, but not completely a circle. It's a little bigger than an acorn. It's maybe a little smaller than a golf ball, about that size. And it grows inside of a slightly bigger green shell. It's a green shell with spikes on the outside. And so what happens is when they fall off of the trees, these conkers, They will hit the ground, and sometimes these shells will crack open, and you will be able to see the conker inside. And that comes up quite a bit in this story, Mr. Brown and the Baby Bear. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were teddy bears. They lived in a little cupboard in the playroom. They had furnished the cupboard home themselves with things that Mr. Brown had found while out walking. He'd brought back acorns for them to use as cups, and soft feathers that he'd found near the duck pond to stuff cushions with. He'd made mirrors from old milk bottle tops and a broom from twigs that he'd collected. All their tables were made from little boxes. In fact, their cupboard was cluttered with the bits and pieces that he'd collected, and one day Mrs. Brown decided that it was full enough. "If you go out today," she said to Mr. Brown, "then you are not to come back with anything. I shall check that your paws are empty when you walk in that door." Mr. Brown hugged her as usual and set off out of the cupboard, and across the room, and down the stairs, and out into the garden. It was a lovely autumn day, and a carpet of leaves covered the lawn. Mr. Brown thought it was great fun crunching through the leaves. He found some especially interesting ones which he thought of taking home, but, remembering Mrs. Brown's warning, he left them where they were. "It's a pity," he said. "I'm sure I could have made something with them." A little further down the garden he found a bright, shiny brown conker. "Oh, what a beauty!" he said to himself as he bent down to polish the gleaming nut with his paw. "The case it come out of must have been huge." And then he saw it, the biggest, most perfect conker case he'd ever seen. The inside was silken smooth and white, and shaped like a round-bottomed bowl. The outside was hard and covered in prickles. "I'm sure I could put something in it," said Mr. Brown, but he remembered Mrs. Brown and sadly left it where it was. Mr. Brown continued down the garden until he came to the fence at the end. He was just about to turn and go back to the house when he saw a heap of leaves. They'd been raked up the day before and piled against the fence. Mr. Brown gazed at the heap and sighed. There was one thing he'd always wanted to do, and that was to jump right into the middle of a heap of dry, crunchy autumn leaves. "Shall I?" he thought to himself. "Just to see what it's like, to see whether it's soft or crunchy or bouncy. I must find out." And, looking round, to make sure nobody was watching, he climbed up on the fence above the leaves. "1, 2, 3, he said out loud, and then he jumped. It was wonderful. The leaves were all crispy, and they crackled softly as he sank gently down, down, down into the springy heap. And then, when he'd stopped sinking into the leaves, Mr. Brown heard a sound. Someone, or something, very near him said, "Ow!" "Well, that wasn't me," said Mr. Brown. "I'm not hurt." "Well, I am," said a little muffled voice. "You're sitting on me." Mr. Brown jumped to his feet, and, pushing his paw deep into the leaves, he pulled out the smallest teddy bear you've ever seen. "Goodness," said Mr. Brown, "it's Toby Small. How did you get in there?" "Somebody took me for a walk and dropped me," said Toby Small, "and then I was raked up with the leaves. I've been here all night, and I'm cold and hungry." "Well, Toby," said Mr. Brown, "I shall take you back to your house this afternoon, but first I think I'd better take you home to Mrs. Brown, so you can have the leaves brushed out of your fur." So Mr. Brown picked up the little bear and carried him back to the house. On the way, he stopped to collect the big conker case that he'd found. He had an idea now how he could use it without making Mrs. Brown angry. Mrs. Brown was waiting at the door of the cupboard when he arrived back. "Now," she said to Mr. Brown when she saw the conker case in his paws, "take that straight back to the garden. We don't need it." "But we do," said Mr. Brown, and he put down the conker case so that Mrs. Brown could see inside it. There, lying fast asleep in the soft, smooth, white bed, was Toby Small. He was tucked up with sheets made from the brightest autumn leaves, and he was smiling happily. "Oh," said Mrs. Brown softly, "I see. You couldn't really leave him outside, could you?" And she carried the sleeping bear in his conker cot into the little cupboard house. When Toby Small had had a sleep and a meal and his fur was brushed free of leaves, Mr. and Mrs. Brown took him home. And after that he came to stay with them for his holidays, and they kept the conker case for him to sleep in. Gradually the cupboard house became more and more cluttered with things that Mr. Brown brought home from his walks, but Mrs. Brown never complained. "We must have something for Toby Small to play with when he comes to stay," she would say. And Mr. Brown just smiled. Mr. Brown, Mrs. Brown, and Toby Small. The end. I hope you enjoyed those autumn-themed stories. I'll see you next time.